When my son Marcus looked me in the eye and said, "Find your own way home, old man. I'm done carrying dead weight," I felt something inside me break. But what he didn't know was that for the past 6 months, I had been recording every conversation we had. Every cruel word, every lie, every manipulation was captured on my phone. That night, as I walked 15 miles home in the rain at 73 years old, I made a decision that would change both our lives forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The recording device in my jacket pocket felt warm against my chest as I sat in the passenger seat of Marcus's BMW, watching the Seattle skyline fade behind us. We were driving back from what was supposed to be a celebration dinner at the Metropolitan, the fancy steakhouse downtown where Marcus had insisted on taking me to commemorate his latest promotion at Blackstone Financial. I should have been proud. My 40-year-old son had just been named Senior Vice President, the culmination of a career I had helped build from the ground up. Instead, I felt hollow listening to him brag about his success while systematically dismissing every sacrifice I had made to him there. The digital recorder had been running for 23 minutes, capturing every word of his monologue about how he had achieved everything through his own brilliance and determination. Not once did he mention the $100,000 I had given him for business school. Not once did he acknowledge the connections I had provided through my 30 years as a respected contractor in this city. Not once did he thank me for the down payment on his Belltown condo or the car we were sitting in. The rain started as we reached the outskirts of Kirkland, where I had lived alone since my wife Elena passed 3 years ago. Marcus turned down the music and glanced at me with that expression I had learned to dread. It was the look he got when he was about to ask for something, usually money, sometimes a favor that would cost me time or dignity or both. "Dad, I need to talk to you about something important," he began, his voice taking on the practiced tone he used with his clients. I pressed the record button on my phone discreetly, a habit I had developed after too many conversations where Marcus would later deny what he had said or twist my words to make me seem unreasonable. "What is it, son?" I asked, though I already suspected where this conversation was heading. The pattern had become predictable over the past few years. Expensive dinner, casual conversation, then the real reason for his sudden interest in spending time with his aging father. "It's about the house," Marcus said, keeping his eyes on the road. "You're rattling around in that big place all by yourself, and honestly, it's not safe for someone your age. I've been thinking it might be time to consider other living arrangements." The house he was referring to was the 4-bedroom colonial on Maple Street that Elena and I had bought in 1987. We had saved for 8 years to afford the down payment, living in a cramped apartment above the hardware store while I built my contracting business from nothing. Every room held memories of raising Marcus, of birthday parties and Christmas mornings, of quiet evenings when Elena would read by the fireplace while I reviewed blueprints at the kitchen table. "Other living arrangements?" I repeated, though I knew exactly what he meant. We had discussed this before, though Marcus seemed to have a selective memory about those previous conversations. "There are some really nice senior communities around here," Marcus continued, warming to his theme. "Places where you'd have people your own age to talk to, activities planned, medical care on site. You wouldn't have to worry about maintaining that big yard or dealing with repairs when things break down." I watched the familiar neighborhoods pass by through the rain-streaked window. These were the streets where I had built half the custom homes, where my reputation for honest work and fair dealing had sustained my family for decades. Marcus wanted me to abandon all of that for the convenience of a sterile facility where I could wait to die surrounded by strangers. "I'm not ready for a nursing home, Marcus," I said quietly. "I'm 73, not 93. I still drive, I still work part-time at the lumber yard, I still have friends in the neighborhood." "It's not a nursing home, Dad. It's independent living. And you're not getting any younger. What happens when you fall down those stairs? What happens when you can't drive anymore? I can't be constantly worrying about you." The irony of his concern struck me silent for a moment. Marcus hadn't visited the house in 4 months. He called perhaps once a week, usually when he needed something. The idea that he was constantly worrying about my welfare was laughable, but I didn't laugh. Instead, I asked the question I already knew he wouldn't answer honestly. Where exactly are you thinking I should move? Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Well, that's the thing. I found this great place called Sunset Manor. It's about 40 minutes south of here, near Tacoma. Really reasonable rates, and they have a waiting list, so if you're interested, we'd need to move fast. 40 minutes south. Far enough that casual visits would become major expeditions. Far enough that I would be effectively removed from the life I had built in this community. Far enough that Marcus could continue his existence without the inconvenience of an aging father who might need something from time to time. And what about the house? I asked, though again I suspected I knew the answer. Well, obviously you'd need to sell it, but that's actually good news because the real estate market is really hot right now. That house is sitting on a lot that's probably worth $400,000, maybe more. You could pay for several years at Sunset Manor and still have money left over. There it was, the real reason for this sudden concern about my welfare. Marcus had been watching the real estate market, calculating the value of the home his parents had bought and maintained for 35 years. In his mind, I was selfishly hoarding an asset that could be converted to cash that would eventually become his inheritance anyway. I see, I said, and I did see, with perfect clarity. Dad, I know this is a big change, but you have to think practically. You're living in the past, holding on to a house that's too big for you because of sentimental attachment. Mom's been gone for 3 years. It's time to move forward. The casual way he dismissed Elena's memory, the dismissive tone he used when talking about sentimental attachment, the assumption that he knew what was best for my life. All of it was being recorded on the device in my pocket, but Marcus continued, apparently convinced that his logic was irrefutable. Besides, Dad, let's be honest about your situation. You're living on Social Security and that little bit you make at the lumber yard. That house is expensive to maintain. The property taxes alone are probably eating up a significant chunk of your income. This way, you'd have real financial security. Financial security. As if I hadn't spent 40 years building a successful business, saving money, making careful investments that had allowed me to maintain a comfortable lifestyle even in retirement. As if the house was a burden rather than the foundation of everything I had worked to achieve. Marcus, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not ready to sell the house. It's my home. It's where your mother and I built our life together. It's where you grew up. Dad, you're being emotional about this instead of practical. That house is just wood and brick and shingles. Mom isn't there. The past isn't there. It's just an expensive pile of materials that's tying up your capital. Just wood and brick and shingles. I thought about the countless weekends Elena and I had spent painting those rooms, the careful attention we had paid to every detail. I thought about the garden she had planted in the backyard, now maintained by Mrs. Chen next door because she knew how much those flowers meant to Elena's memory. I thought about the workshop in the basement where I had taught Marcus to use tools, back when he was still young enough to look up to his father. I'm not selling the house, son, I repeated, with more firmness this time. The silence that followed was heavy with Marcus's frustration. I could see his jaw tightening, the same expression he had worn as a child when he didn't get his way. Except now he was a 40-year-old man who had learned more sophisticated methods of manipulation. Dad, I was hoping we could discuss this reasonably, but I can see you're going to be stubborn about it. Let me put this in perspective for you. You're 73 years old. You're showing signs of forgetfulness. Last month when I called, you couldn't remember what day it was. You're making poor financial decisions, like that ridiculous amount you spent on a new roof when you could have just patched it temporarily. The roof had cost $8,000. I had saved for 2 years to replace it properly, hiring Tommy Stevenson's crew because I knew they would do quality work. The old roof had been leaking in 3 places, damaging the ceiling in the master bedroom where Elena and I had slept for 30 years. But in Marcus's mind, this was evidence of poor judgment rather than responsible home maintenance. Marcus, there's nothing wrong with my memory, and there's nothing wrong with my decision-making. I chose to replace the roof because it needed replacing. I can afford to maintain my own home. Can you, though? Can you really afford it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're spending down your savings on a house that's going to be mine eventually anyway. Wouldn't it make more sense to sell it now while you can still enjoy some of the proceeds? There it was again. The casual assumption that my property, my life's work, my home, was really his inheritance that I was temporarily occupying. The idea that my continued residence in my own house was somehow depriving him of what he considered rightfully his. The house is mine, Marcus. I'll decide what to do with it and when. Dad, I'm trying to help you here, but you're making this very difficult. I've done research on Sunset Manor, I've talked to financial advisors about the best way to structure this transition, I've put time and effort into solving your problems, and you're rejecting my help because of some emotional attachment to a building. His problems. As if my desire to live in my own home was a problem that needed his solution. We had reached my neighborhood now, the familiar streets lined with mature trees and well-maintained houses where people had lived for decades, building relationships and community ties that meant something. Marcus pulled into my driveway and put the car in park, but he didn't turn off the engine. The message was clear. This was a brief stop, not a visit. Dad, I need you to think seriously about what I've said tonight. You're not getting any younger, and this situation isn't sustainable. I can't be constantly worried about your welfare while you're rattling around in that big house by yourself. Constantly worried. The phrase he had used before, as if his concern for my welfare was a crushing burden that kept him awake at night. I had learned to recognize these phrases as manipulation tactics, ways of making his self-interest sound like sacrifice. I am thinking seriously about it, Marcus, and my answer is no. I'm not selling my house, and I'm not moving to Sunset Manor or anywhere else. This is my home. Marcus's expression hardened. The polite veneer of concern slipped away, replaced by something colder and more familiar. This was the face he showed when his clients rejected his financial advice, when his carefully constructed presentations failed to achieve their intended results. Dad, I was hoping we could handle this like adults, but I can see you're going to force me to be direct. You're making poor decisions, you're isolated, you're stubborn, and you're not thinking clearly about your future. If you won't accept help voluntarily, there are other options. Other options. The threat was implicit but clear. If I wouldn't cooperate with his plans, he was prepared to pursue more aggressive measures. Perhaps he would claim I was incompetent to handle my own affairs. Perhaps he would find some legal mechanism to force the sale of my home. Perhaps he would simply stop all contact, leaving me truly isolated in the way he claimed I already was. What other options would those be, Marcus? Dad, don't make this harder than it needs to be. I'm offering you a chance to make this transition with dignity on your own terms. But if you refuse to be reasonable, if you insist on clinging to this house while your mental faculties decline, then I'll have to consider what's best for your welfare, even if you can't see it yourself. Mental faculties decline? Another accusation without evidence. Another way of suggesting that my disagreement with his plans was proof of incompetence rather than a reasonable difference of opinion. My mental faculties are fine, Marcus. My decision-making is sound. And my answer remains no. Fine, Marcus said, his voice taking on a tone of finality. Fine. I've tried to help you, Dad. I've offered you solutions. I've researched options. I've put my own time and energy into trying to improve your situation. But if you want to be stubborn, if you want to make bad choices, then that's on you. He reached across me to open the passenger door, a gesture that was both physically dismissive and symbolically clear. The conversation was over, and I was being ejected from his vehicle and, by extension, from his life. I guess you'll just have to find your own way from now on, Marcus continued, his voice rising with frustration. I'm done carrying dead weight. I have my own life to worry about, my own family to think about. I can't keep wasting my time on someone who won't accept help. Find your own way. Dead weight. Wasting time. Each phrase was carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage, to make me understand that my continued independence was a burden he was no longer willing to bear. I stepped out into the rain, feeling the cold water immediately soak through my jacket. As I closed the passenger door, Marcus rolled down the window for one final comment. "Dad, when you fall down those stairs, when you have a medical emergency, when you realize you can't take care of yourself anymore, don't call me. I've offered you help, and you've rejected it. Find your own way home." With that, he rolled up the window and backed out of my driveway, leaving me standing in the rain outside my own house. The taillights of his BMW disappeared around the corner, and I was alone with the recording device in my pocket and a clarity of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I stood there for several minutes, letting the rain soak through my clothes while I processed what had just happened. My son, the boy I had raised, the young man I had supported through college and graduate school, the adult I had helped establish in his career, had just told me that my desire to live in my own home made me dead weight. He had threatened me with abandonment, with legal action, with the withdrawal of all family support because I wouldn't voluntarily liquidate my assets for his convenience. But what Marcus didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined, was that I had been recording our conversations for months. Every manipulative statement, every veiled threat, every casual dismissal of my autonomy and intelligence was captured on digital files that I had been carefully organizing and storing. I had started recording initially just to help my own memory, to have a record of what had actually been said when Marcus would later claim he had never made certain statements or promises. But now I realized that these recordings represented something much more powerful. They represented the truth. Inside my house, I sat at the kitchen table where Elena and I had shared thousands of meals, where we had made our financial plans and discussed our dreams for the future. I pulled out my phone and connected it to the small digital recorder I had been using, transferring the evening's conversation to my computer. The audio quality was excellent. Every word was clear, every tone and inflection preserved. I opened the folder where I had been storing these recordings over the past 6 months. There were dozens of them now, a comprehensive documentation of Marcus's true attitude toward his aging father. In one, he complained to someone on the phone about having to visit me, calling it a waste of his weekend. In another, he discussed my finances with his wife Samantha, speculating about when I would die and how much the house would be worth then. In a third, he laughed about my part-time job at the lumberyard, mocking my need to stay busy in retirement. Each recording revealed a different aspect of the man my son had become. The successful financial advisor who presented himself as a caring son in public, while privately viewing his father as an obstacle to his inheritance. The smooth-talking professional who could justify any position with careful rhetoric while revealing his true motivations in unguarded moments. I spent the next 3 hours listening to these recordings chronologically, creating a timeline of Marcus's campaign to convince me to sell my house. The progression was clear. Initial suggestions about downsizing had evolved into expressions of concern about my safety. Concerns about my safety had become questions about my mental competence. Questions about my competence had become tonight's direct threats and ultimatums. By the time I went to bed that night, I had a plan. The next morning, I called my attorney, Robert Martinez, who had handled Elena's estate and various business matters over the years. Robert had known me for 15 years, had seen me navigate complex financial decisions with clarity and competence. If anyone could attest to my mental faculties, it would be Robert. "Robert, I need to schedule an appointment to discuss some family matters," I said when he answered the phone. "Of course, Thomas. Is everything all right?" "I'm not sure yet, but I think I may need some advice about protecting my interests from my own son." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Robert was too experienced to express shock at family conflicts, but I could hear the concern in his voice when he replied, "Can you come in this afternoon? I have an opening at 2 o'clock." Robert's office occupied the 3rd floor of a historic building in downtown Kirkland, with windows overlooking the lake and bookshelves lined with legal references accumulated over 30 years of practice. He greeted me with genuine warmth, the kind of professional relationship that had evolved into real friendship over the years. "Thomas, you look well," he said, shaking my hand firmly. How are you holding up since Elena passed? I'm managing, Robert. Better than some people think, apparently. I spent the next hour explaining the situation, playing selected recordings for Robert while he took careful notes. His expression grew increasingly serious as he listened to Marcus's voice discussing my mental competence and his plans to force me into a senior living facility. Thomas, I have to ask some direct questions, Robert said when I finished. How is your health, both physical and mental? Are you taking any medications that might affect your judgment? Have you noticed any decline in your ability to handle complex decisions? These were the questions I had expected, the ones Marcus would have asked if he had been genuinely concerned rather than manipulative. I answered them honestly. My health was good for my age. I took medication for high blood pressure and cholesterol, neither of which affected my mental clarity. I continued to handle my own finances, maintain my property, and work part-time at the lumberyard without difficulty. Your son seems to believe you're incompetent to handle your own affairs, Robert observed. Based on our conversation today and my knowledge of you over the years, I see no evidence to support that claim. But Thomas, what exactly do you want to accomplish here? Do you want to protect your assets from potential legal challenges? Do you want to cut Marcus out of your will? Do you want to confront him with evidence of his duplicity? The question forced me to articulate what I had been feeling since the previous night. I wanted justice. Not revenge exactly, but consequences for Marcus's behavior. I wanted him to understand that his manipulation had been discovered, that his threats had backfired, that his assumption of my helplessness had been a catastrophic miscalculation. I want to show him these recordings, Robert. I want him to know that I know exactly what kind of person he's become, and I want to make sure he can never force me out of my home or take control of my assets based on false claims about my competence. Robert nodded thoughtfully. We can certainly structure your estate planning to protect against those possibilities, and the recordings you've made are legal under Washington state law since you were a party to all the conversations. But Thomas, be very careful about how you proceed. Family relationships, once damaged this severely, rarely recover. Robert, the relationship was already damaged. I just didn't realize how badly until I started paying attention to what Marcus was actually saying rather than what I hoped he meant. Over the next 2 weeks, Robert and I worked together to restructure my estate planning with multiple layers of protection. We created a trust that would allow me to retain control of my assets during my lifetime while preventing any potential challenges based on claims of incompetence. We updated my will with specific language about my mental state at the time of signing. We prepared powers of attorney documents that explicitly excluded Marcus from any decision-making authority unless I became genuinely incapacitated, and then only with the agreement of multiple independent parties. More importantly, we prepared a comprehensive file documenting the timeline of Marcus's manipulation attempts, complete with transcripts of the most damaging recordings and a detailed analysis of his behavior patterns. This file would serve as evidence if Marcus ever tried to challenge my competence legally. But before implementing any of these protective measures, I had one more conversation to conduct, one more recording to make. I called Marcus on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after our dinner at the Metropolitan. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice carrying that slightly impatient tone he used when interrupted during weekend activities. "Hi, Dad, what's up?" "Marcus, I'd like to talk with you about our conversation a few weeks ago. Are you available to meet sometime today?" "Today? Dad, it's Saturday. Samantha and I have plans. Can't this wait until next week?" The casual dismissal was so predictable that I had prepared for it. "Marcus, this is important. It concerns the future of my house and my living arrangements. I think you'll want to hear what I have to say." The change in his tone was immediate. The impatience disappeared, replaced by the focused attention he gave to potentially profitable opportunities. "Oh, well, I guess I could meet you for coffee this afternoon. How about that place near your house, the one in downtown Kirkland?" "Actually, Marcus, I'd prefer to meet at my house. There are some documents I want to show you, and we'll have privacy to discuss this properly." "Documents? What kind of documents?" "Just come over around 2 o'clock, son. We'll talk then." Marcus arrived precisely on time, carrying a leather portfolio that suggested he had prepared materials of his own. He seemed optimistic, probably assuming that I had reconsidered his proposals and was ready to discuss the details of selling my house and moving to Sunset Manor. I let him in through the front door, noting how his eyes automatically surveyed the entryway and living room, probably calculating square footage and resale value. We sat in the same chairs where Elena and I used to watch the evening news, where Marcus had opened Christmas presents as a child, where we had celebrated his graduation from business school. "Dad, I'm glad you called," Marcus began, opening his portfolio. "I've been thinking about our conversation, and I realize I may have come across as pushy. I want you to know that everything I suggested came from genuine concern for your welfare." The recording device in my pocket was already running. I had positioned a backup recorder on the bookshelf behind my chair, disguised among Elena's collection of paperback novels. Marcus's next words would be preserved with perfect clarity. "I appreciate that, Marcus, but before we discuss your proposals, I want to share something with you." I pulled out my phone and set it on the coffee table between us. Marcus looked at it curiously, not yet understanding the significance. "Marcus, for the past 6 months, I've been recording our conversations." The color drained from his face so quickly that I thought he might faint. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. For perhaps the first time in years, my son was completely speechless. "I started recording initially just to help my own memory," I continued calmly. "You know how you sometimes say things differently than I remember them? But as I listened to these recordings, I began to notice patterns in your behavior that concerned me." Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Dad, you can't record people without their permission. That's illegal." "Actually, Marcus, in Washington state, it's perfectly legal to record conversations when you're a participant. I've checked with my attorney to be certain." The mention of an attorney caused another visible reaction. Marcus's carefully maintained composure was cracking, revealing something desperate underneath. "Let me play a few examples for you," I said, touching the screen of my phone. The first recording was from 2 months ago. Marcus's voice filled the room, discussing my living situation with someone on the phone. "The old man is being stubborn about the house," the recording said. "It's worth $400,000 at least, and he's just sitting on it like some kind of miser. He can't live there forever, and the longer he waits, the more money we lose to maintenance and property taxes." Marcus stared at the phone as his own voice continued. "I've been working on him, playing up the safety concerns and his age. Samantha thinks I should push harder, maybe find a way to have him declared incompetent, but I think I can convince him voluntarily if I'm patient." I stopped the recording and looked at my son. His face had gone completely white, and his hands were trembling slightly. "That's taken out of context," Marcus said weakly. "I was just expressing frustration to Samantha. I didn't mean it the way it sounds."
"Let me play another one," I said, selecting a different file. This recording was from 3 weeks ago, the night of our dinner at the Metropolitan. Marcus's voice was clear and unmistakable as he spoke to his wife after dropping me off. "The old fool is going to force me to take legal action," his recorded voice said. "I tried to reason with him, tried to make him see that he's not capable of living independently anymore, but he's too proud and too stupid to accept reality." I paused the recording. "Tell me, Marcus, which part of this conversation is taken out of context?" Marcus stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. "Dad, I know how this must sound, but you have to understand the pressure I'm under. Samantha and I are trying to plan our financial future, and we have to consider what's going to happen to your assets eventually." "My assets," I repeated. "The house I bought with my wife, the savings I accumulated through 40 years of work, the property I maintain with my own labor. You refer to all of this as your financial future?" "Dad, I'm your only son. Eventually, when you're gone, these things will become my responsibility anyway. I'm just trying to help you manage them while you still can." The rationalization was so smooth, so practiced, that I wondered how many times Marcus had used this logic to justify his behavior to himself and others. "Let me play one more recording," I said, selecting the file from our dinner 3 weeks ago. Marcus's voice filled the room again, but this time it was the conversation from his car when he had told me to find my own way home and called me dead weight. As the recording played, I watched my son's face cycle through emotions. Shame, anger, fear, and something that might have been genuine remorse flickered across his features. When his recorded voice finished telling me not to call him when I had a medical emergency, the silence in the room was profound. "Marcus," I said quietly, "do you remember telling me that my mental faculties were declining? Do you remember suggesting that I was making poor decisions and couldn't think clearly about my future?" He nodded reluctantly, unable to meet my eyes. "I want you to explain to me how a man with declining mental faculties managed to systematically document your manipulation attempts over a 6-month period. I want you to explain how someone who can't think clearly was able to recognize your behavior patterns and take steps to protect himself." Marcus sank back into his chair, his portfolio forgotten on the floor beside him. "Dad, I'm sorry. I know I said some awful things, but I was frustrated and worried about you." "No, Marcus. You were frustrated and worried about my money. There's a difference." I stood up and walked to the mantel, where Elena's photograph smiled down at us from its silver frame. "Your mother always defended you," I said, not turning around. "When you were 35 and still needed money for car payments, she said you were just getting established. When you missed her birthday 2 years running, she said you were busy with your career. When you came to her funeral and spent the entire time on your phone checking stock prices, she would have said you were dealing with grief in your own way." I turned back to face Marcus. "But Elena isn't here to make excuses for you anymore. And I'm not going to pretend that your behavior is acceptable just because you're my son." Marcus was crying now, though I wasn't sure if the tears were from genuine remorse or from the realization that his plans had been completely exposed. "Dad, please. I know I've made mistakes, but we can fix this. We're family. We can work through this together." "Family," I repeated. "Marcus, when you drove away that night and left me standing in the rain, you made it clear that we're not family in any meaningful sense. I'm just an obstacle between you and your inheritance." I returned to my chair and picked up my phone. "I have 43 recordings of our conversations, Marcus. 43 separate instances of you lying to me, manipulating me, or discussing my welfare as if it were your personal financial problem. I've had them professionally transcribed and analyzed by my attorney." "Your attorney?" Marcus's voice cracked. "Robert Martinez. You remember Robert. He handled your mother's estate. He's known me for 15 years, and he can attest to my mental competence. In fact, he's prepared a comprehensive evaluation of my decision-making capacity that contradicts every claim you've made about my declining faculties." Marcus slumped forward, his head in his hands. "Dad, what do you want from me? What can I do to fix this?" "I want you to understand that your behavior has consequences, Marcus. I want you to realize that treating your father like a mark in one of your financial schemes was a choice, and choices have results." I opened the folder on the coffee table and withdrew a stack of legal documents. "I've restructured my entire estate planning, Marcus. You are no longer my beneficiary. You have no authority over my medical decisions. You have no claim on my property or my assets. Everything I've worked for in my life will go to charity when I die." The impact of these words was immediate and devastating. Marcus looked up from his hands, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. "Dad, you can't be serious. I'm your son. I made some mistakes, but you can't just cut me out of your life over a few conversations." A few conversations? Marcus, this isn't about conversations. This is about character. This is about who you've chosen to become as a man. I leaned forward, meeting his eyes directly. "For 6 months, you have systematically attempted to manipulate me into surrendering my independence and my property. You've questioned my mental competence, threatened legal action, and made it clear that my continued existence in my own home is an inconvenience you're no longer willing to tolerate."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Marcus started to interrupt, but I held up my hand. "You told me to find my own way home, Marcus. You called me dead weight. You said you were done carrying me. Well, congratulations. You've gotten exactly what you asked for." The silence stretched between us. Outside, I could hear children playing in the street, the normal sounds of a neighborhood where family still meant something. Inside my living room, I watched my son grapple with the reality that his manipulation had been discovered and his inheritance had disappeared. "Dad, please," Marcus said finally, "give me another chance. Let me prove that I can be the son you raised me to be." The son I raised would never have threatened his father with abandonment unless he surrendered his home. The son I raised would have visited regularly, not just when he needed something. The son I raised would have grieved his mother's death instead of calculating the value of her estate. I gathered the legal documents and returned them to their folder. "Marcus, you made a choice when you decided that your convenience was more important than my dignity. You made a choice when you decided that my assets were more significant than my autonomy. You made a choice when you told me to find my own way home." I stood up, indicating that the conversation was over. "Now you get to live with the consequences of those choices." Marcus remained seated, staring at the floor. "How long?" he asked quietly. "How long what? How long have you known? How long have you been planning this?" "I've known who you really are for 6 months, Marcus. I've been planning this response for 3 weeks, since the night you abandoned me in the rain." Marcus finally stood, moving like a man who had aged a decade in the past hour. "Is there anything I can do? Any way to change your mind?" I considered the question seriously, though I already knew the answer. "Marcus, if you had come here today and apologized genuinely, if you had acknowledged your behavior without making excuses, if you had shown real remorse for the pain you've caused, we might have found a way forward." I gestured toward the phone on the coffee table. "Instead, you started with more lies and manipulation. Even now, knowing that I have recordings of everything you've said, your first instinct was to justify and rationalize your behavior." Marcus picked up his portfolio from the floor, his movements slow and defeated. "Dad, I want you to know that I do love you." "No, Marcus, you love my money. You love the security of knowing that someday my assets will become your assets. You love the idea of having a father, but you've never shown any interest in actually being a son." I walked to the front door and opened it. "Marcus, I want you to understand something clearly. This conversation is being recorded, just like all the others. If you attempt any legal challenges to my competence, if you try to contest my estate planning, if you make any effort to force me out of my home, these recordings will become public evidence of your character and motivations." Marcus paused in the doorway. "What about Samantha? What about your grandchildren?" The question revealed how little he understood about the damage he had done. "Marcus, you don't have children. You've been married for 8 years, and you've never had children because they would interfere with your lifestyle and your financial goals. Samantha made that very clear in one of the conversations I recorded." Marcus's shoulders sagged as he realized that even his final attempt at manipulation had failed. He stepped out onto the front porch, then turned back one last time. "Dad, I hope someday you'll forgive me." "Marcus, forgiveness requires genuine repentance. You can't apologize for being caught while continuing to believe your behavior was justified." I closed the door and listened to his footsteps retreat down the front walk. From the window, I watched him sit in his BMW for several minutes before driving away. He probably called Samantha immediately, explaining that the old man had lost his mind and disinherited him over nothing. He probably started planning his next approach, perhaps involving claims about my mental health or my susceptibility to outside influence. What Marcus didn't realize was that I had anticipated these possibilities. Robert Martinez had prepared for every potential challenge, every possible legal maneuver that a desperate son might attempt. The recordings were just the beginning of my defense strategy. Over the next 3 days, I implemented the second phase of my plan. I visited Dr. Sarah Chen, my physician for the past 12 years, and requested a comprehensive mental health evaluation. Dr. Chen had known me since before Elena's death, had seen me navigate the challenges of caregiving with clarity and purpose. She was puzzled by my request until I explained the situation. "Thomas, I can certainly perform a cognitive assessment, but I have to tell you that in all our interactions over the years, I've never noticed any signs of mental decline. Your medication compliance is excellent, your ability to discuss complex medical decisions is clear, and your emotional processing of Elena's death has been entirely appropriate." The evaluation took 2 hours and covered memory, reasoning, decision-making capacity, and emotional stability. Dr. Chen's written report concluded that I demonstrated cognitive function consistent with someone 20 years younger and showed no signs of dementia, depression, or any other condition that would impair my judgment. I also scheduled appointments with my financial advisor, my insurance agent, and the manager at the lumber yard where I worked part-time. Each of them provided written statements about my mental competence and my ability to handle complex decisions independently. By the end of the week, I had assembled a comprehensive file documenting my cognitive health from multiple independent sources. But the most important conversation took place with Father Miguel Santos at St. Catherine's Church, where Elena and I had worshipped for 25 years. Father Miguel had known our family through Marcus's childhood, had performed Elena's funeral service, and had counseled me through the grief process over the past 3 years. "Thomas, I'm troubled by what you've told me about Marcus," Father Miguel said as we sat in his small office behind the sanctuary. "But I'm also concerned about the path you've chosen in response. Cutting off your only child, even after such betrayal, seems like a decision you might regret later."
Father Miguel's concern was genuine, and I respected his perspective too much to dismiss it casually. "Father, I've been thinking about this for weeks. I keep asking myself what Elena would want me to do, what the right response is to Marcus's behavior, and what conclusions have you reached? I think Elena would want me to protect myself from further manipulation, but she would also want Marcus to face the consequences of his choices. She always believed that people learn from natural consequences better than from lectures or forgiveness that comes too easily." Father Miguel nodded thoughtfully. "The Church teaches about redemption and second chances, Thomas, but it also teaches that true repentance requires acknowledgement of wrongdoing and a genuine commitment to change. Has Marcus shown either of those things?" I thought about Marcus's response when confronted with the recordings. His immediate instinct had been to justify his behavior, to minimize the significance of his words, to claim that his manipulation was actually concern for my welfare. "No, Father, he hasn't. Even when faced with evidence of what he's said and done, his first response was to make excuses." "Then perhaps what you're offering him is not cruelty, but an opportunity for genuine reflection. Sometimes people need to experience the full weight of their choices before they can truly understand the harm they've caused." Father Miguel nodded thoughtfully. "The Church teaches about redemption and second chances, Thomas, but it also teaches that true repentance requires acknowledgement of wrongdoing and a genuine commitment to change. Has Marcus shown either of those things?" I thought about Marcus's response when confronted with the recordings. His immediate instinct had been to justify his behavior, to minimize the significance of his words, to claim that his manipulation was actually concern for my welfare. No, Father, he hasn't. Even when faced with evidence of what he said and done, his first response was to make excuses. Then perhaps what you're offering him is not cruelty, but an opportunity for genuine reflection. Sometimes people need to experience the full weight of their choices before they can truly understand the harm they've caused. Father Miguel's support was crucial, not just for my own peace of mind, but for the practical reality that Marcus might try to use my church community against me. If he claimed that grief or isolation had affected my judgment, Father Miguel could testify that my decision-making process had been careful, prayerful, and consistent with my values over many years. The following Monday morning, I received the first indication that Marcus was escalating his efforts. Dr. Chen called to inform me that someone claiming to be my son had contacted her office requesting information about my mental health and any medications that might affect my judgment. Of course, I couldn't provide any information due to patient confidentiality laws, Dr. Chen explained. But Thomas, this suggests that your son is pursuing some kind of legal challenge to your competence. You might want to alert your attorney. I thanked Dr. Chen and immediately called Robert Martinez. He was not surprised by Marcus's move, having predicted that desperation would lead to increasingly aggressive tactics. Thomas, this is exactly why we documented your mental health so thoroughly. If Marcus tries to have you declared incompetent, we have overwhelming evidence to the contrary. In fact, his attempt to obtain your medical records without authorization could backfire legally. Robert's confidence was reassuring, but I realized that Marcus's campaign was just beginning. Over the next few days, I received visits from Adult Protective Services, who had received an anonymous report about an elderly man living alone who might be vulnerable to self-neglect or financial exploitation. The social worker, Janet Phillips, was professional but thorough. She toured my house, reviewed my finances, and asked detailed questions about my daily routine and support system. Her report concluded that I was living independently without any signs of neglect or vulnerability. Mr. Rodriguez, I have to tell you that the person who made this report claimed you were showing signs of paranoia and making irrational financial decisions, Janet said as she prepared to leave. But everything I've observed suggests that you're managing your affairs quite competently. I thanked Janet for her diligence and made a mental note to inform Robert about this latest development. Marcus was clearly working through multiple channels, probably hoping that one of his strategies would succeed in establishing grounds for a competency challenge. The next attack came through my workplace. Pete Morrison, the owner of Morrison Lumber, called me at home on Thursday evening with an uncomfortable question. Thomas, I received a strange phone call today from someone claiming to be your son. He said he was concerned about your ability to work safely and suggested that I might want to reconsider your employment for liability reasons. Pete had known me for 8 years, had seen me work carefully and competently on hundreds of customer orders. The suggestion that I was a safety risk was absurd, and Pete recognized it as such. I told him that your work performance has always been excellent and that any concerns about your employment should come directly from you, Pete continued. But Thomas, what's going on with your family? This doesn't sound like normal worry about an aging parent. I explained the situation to Pete in general terms, focusing on Marcus's attempts to force me out of my home and his frustration with my refusal to comply. Pete listened with growing anger. Thomas, in 40 years of running this business, I've learned to recognize when someone is trying to manipulate a situation for their own benefit. Your son isn't concerned about your welfare. He's trying to isolate you and make you dependent on him. Pete's assessment was exactly correct, and his support was crucial. If Marcus tried to claim that my judgment was impaired, my continued employment at a job requiring precision and safety awareness would be powerful evidence to the contrary. But Marcus's most sophisticated attack came through the financial sector. I discovered it during my regular monthly meeting with David Kim, my financial advisor for the past 15 years. Thomas, I need to discuss something sensitive with you, David said, his usual friendly demeanor replaced by professional concern.
I received a call from someone claiming to represent your interests, suggesting that your recent changes to beneficiary designations might have been made under duress or without full understanding of their implications. This was Marcus's cleverest move yet. Rather than directly challenging my competence, he was suggesting that I had been influenced by outside parties to make decisions that weren't in my best interests. David, did this person identify themselves specifically? They claimed to be a financial consultant working on behalf of your family, but they wouldn't provide credentials or explain exactly who had hired them. They asked detailed questions about your portfolio, your recent transactions, and your estate planning changes. I pulled out my phone and played a brief excerpt from one of Marcus's recorded conversations for David. The recognition on David's face was immediate. Thomas, that's definitely the same voice. Your son has been trying to gather information about your finances from multiple sources. David's revelation confirmed what I had suspected. Marcus wasn't just questioning my competence randomly. He was building a case, assembling evidence that he could present to a court to support claims about my vulnerability to exploitation or my inability to make sound financial decisions. David, I need you to document this contact and any other attempts to access my financial information. If this escalates to legal proceedings, your testimony about Marcus's behavior will be crucial. Over the weekend, I organized all the evidence I had collected into a comprehensive file. The recordings were professionally transcribed and organized chronologically. The mental health evaluations, character references, and documentation of Marcus's investigation attempts were arranged to tell a clear story of manipulation, deception, and attempted financial exploitation. But I also realized that defensive measures weren't enough. Marcus was clearly committed to his campaign, and he would continue escalating until he either succeeded in his goals or faced consequences severe enough to deter further efforts. It was time for the final phase of my plan. Monday morning, I called Channel 7 News and asked to speak with Jennifer Walsh, the investigative reporter who specialized in elder abuse and financial exploitation stories. Jennifer had won awards for her coverage of scams targeting senior citizens, and I believed she would be interested in a story about adult children manipulating their aging parents. Mr. Rodriguez, what you're describing is more common than people realize, Jennifer said.
Adult children who see their parents' assets as their inheritance often resort to manipulation and intimidation when their parents won't cooperate voluntarily. I offered to provide Jennifer with recordings of Marcus's conversations, documentation of his investigation attempts, and expert testimony about my mental competence. She agreed to meet with me and review the evidence. Jennifer's investigation took 2 weeks. She interviewed my doctor, my attorney, my financial advisor, and several neighbors who could attest to my independence and mental clarity. She also attempted to contact Marcus for his side of the story, but he refused to speak with her. The resulting news story was devastating for Marcus's reputation. Jennifer presented the evidence methodically, allowing viewers to hear Marcus's recorded voice discussing his father's assets as if they were already his property, threatening abandonment unless I surrendered my independence, and attempting to gather information to support incompetency claims. The story aired during the evening news on a Tuesday, with follow-up coverage throughout the week. By Friday, Marcus's employer had placed him on administrative leave pending an investigation into his professional conduct. Several of his clients had requested different advisors, citing concerns about his character and judgment. But the most significant consequence came from an unexpected source. Samantha, Marcus's wife of 8 years, filed for divorce the following Monday. Through mutual acquaintances, I learned that she had been unaware of the extent of Marcus's manipulation and had been horrified by the recordings played during the news coverage. Marcus called me that evening, his voice barely controlled as he struggled with rage and desperation. "Dad, do you realize what you've done? Do you understand how you've destroyed my life?" I had been expecting this call and was recording it, of course. "Marcus, I haven't destroyed anything. I've simply revealed the truth about your behavior." "The truth? You've taken private conversations out of context and used them to humiliate me publicly.
You've cost me my job, my marriage, my reputation. For what? Because I was worried about your safety?" The self-deception in his voice was remarkable. Even now, facing the complete collapse of his professional and personal life, Marcus continued to frame his manipulation as concern for my welfare. "Marcus, every word on those recordings was spoken by you. Every threat was made by you. Every attempt to undermine my independence was initiated by you. I didn't take anything out of context. I simply preserved the evidence of who you really are." "I'm your son," Marcus screamed into the phone. "How could you do this to your own family?" "Marcus, you stopped being my son the night you told me to find my own way home. You became something else, a predator who saw an elderly man as an opportunity for financial gain." The silence that followed was profound. When Marcus spoke again, his voice was cold and final. "Dad, you've won. I hope you're satisfied. I hope your revenge was worth losing your only child." "Marcus, this was never about revenge. This was about consequences. You made choices, and choices have results. You chose to manipulate instead of love. You chose to threaten instead of support. You chose to see your father as dead weight instead of family. Fine. You want to be alone? You want to prove how independent you are? Enjoy your empty house and your bitter victory. But don't expect any sympathy when you're dying alone with no one to care about you." The line went dead, and I sat quietly in my kitchen processing the finality of that conversation. Marcus had revealed his true character one last time, responding to consequences with threats and manipulation rather than reflection or remorse. 2 weeks later, I received a certified letter from Marcus's attorney, officially notifying me that he was contesting my will and demanding a competency evaluation. Robert Martinez had anticipated this move and had already filed counter-motions presenting our evidence of Marcus's manipulation attempts and my demonstrated mental capacity. The legal proceedings stretched over 4 months, but the outcome was never really in doubt. The recordings provided overwhelming evidence of Marcus's motivations and methods. The professional evaluations of my mental health were unassailable. The documentation of Marcus's investigation attempts proved his calculating approach to the situation. The judge's final ruling was comprehensive and damning. Not only did she uphold my right to structure my estate as I chose, but she also issued a restraining order preventing Marcus from further harassment or investigation attempts. Her written opinion described Marcus's behavior as a textbook example of elder financial abuse, and praised my remarkable foresight in documenting the systematic manipulation attempts. The local newspaper covered the court ruling, ensuring that Marcus's reputation in the community was permanently damaged. His attempts to find new employment in the financial services industry were repeatedly unsuccessful, as potential employers inevitably discovered his history through internet searches. But the most telling development came 6 months after the court ruling. I learned through Father Miguel that Marcus had approached the church, asking for financial assistance. The man who had viewed his father's assets as his inheritance, who had built his lifestyle around expected wealth that was never really his, now found himself struggling to pay basic expenses. Father Miguel had counseled Marcus about repentance and reconciliation, but according to the priest, Marcus remained focused on his own suffering rather than the harm he had caused others. "He spoke about losing everything because of your vendetta against him," Father Miguel told me during one of our regular conversations. I tried to help him understand that acknowledging his mistakes was the first step toward healing, but he seemed unable to accept responsibility for the consequences of his own choices. This confirmed what I had suspected all along. Marcus hadn't learned anything meaningful from his experience. He still viewed himself as the victim of an unreasonable father, rather than the perpetrator of attempted financial abuse. A year after our final phone conversation, I received word that Marcus had moved to Portland, apparently hoping to restart his career where his reputation hadn't preceded him. Samantha had remarried, and according to friends, she had described her marriage to Marcus as a nightmare of manipulation and selfishness that I should have recognized much sooner. By that time, my own life had found a new rhythm and purpose. The Margaret Foster Memorial Foundation had been renamed the Elena Rodriguez Community Education Fund, honoring my wife's lifelong commitment to helping others improve their circumstances through learning and opportunity. I had also become something of an advocate for elder rights, speaking at community centers and senior organizations about recognizing and preventing financial abuse by family members. My story had resonated with many other parents who had experienced similar manipulation from adult children who viewed their inheritance as an entitlement rather than a gift. Dr. Chen had introduced me to Rebecca Torres, a widow my age whose husband had died in a car accident 2 years before Elena's passing. Rebecca was a retired teacher who shared my interest in community service and education advocacy. Our friendship had developed slowly and naturally, built on shared values and genuine affection rather than the desperate loneliness that sometimes drives hasty relationships among seniors.
Rebecca had her own difficult experience with adult children who had attempted to control her finances and living arrangements after her husband's death. She understood my decision to prioritize independence and dignity over family harmony that existed only when I submitted to manipulation. Thomas, people who have never experienced this kind of systematic manipulation from their own children find it hard to believe, Rebecca said, as we worked together on a grant application for the education fund. They think family bonds should overcome any conflict, that forgiveness should be automatic regardless of behavior. But they don't understand that some behavior is designed to exploit those exact assumptions, I replied. Marcus counted on my love for him to make me vulnerable to his manipulation. He assumed that my desire to maintain our relationship would override my judgment about his actions. Rebecca nodded with the understanding of someone who had faced similar challenges. My daughter Lisa tried the same approach. Expressions of concern about my safety, questions about my mental sharpness, suggestions about more appropriate living situations, all designed to make me doubt my own judgment and accept her control over my finances. Rebecca's situation had been resolved differently than mine. Lisa had backed down when confronted directly, apparently recognizing that her mother was too aware of the manipulation tactics to be successfully deceived. But the underlying dynamic had been identical. Adult children treating their parents' independence as an obstacle to their own financial planning. Our shared experience had created a bond that was deeper than romantic attraction, though affection had certainly developed between us over the months of working together. We were both people who had successfully defended our autonomy against family members who should have been protecting it instead of exploiting it. 2 years after my final confrontation with Marcus, I received an unexpected phone call from a social worker in Portland. Marcus had been hospitalized following what was described as a nervous breakdown, apparently triggered by continued employment difficulties and social isolation. "Mr. Rodriguez, your son has listed you as his emergency contact, though he's indicated that your relationship is currently strained," the social worker explained. "He's asking to speak with you, but I wanted to check whether you're willing to accept such contact." I considered the question carefully. Marcus had been hospitalized before making this request, suggesting that he might genuinely be in crisis rather than attempting another manipulation. But I also remembered his pattern of using apparent vulnerability to create guilt and obligation in others. "I'll speak with him," I decided, "but I want the conversation to be recorded for my own protection." The social worker arranged for a supervised phone call the following day. Marcus's voice was subdued, lacking the confident tone that had characterized all our previous conversations. "Dad, I know I have no right to ask for anything from you, but I wanted you to know that I understand now what I did to you. I understand how I treated you." The words sounded different than his previous apologies.
There was none of the defensive rationalization or the subtle blame shifting that had characterized his earlier attempts at reconciliation. "What exactly do you understand, Marcus?" "I understand that I saw you as an obstacle instead of a person. I understand that I treated your home and your savings as if they already belonged to me. I understand that I tried to manipulate you into giving up your independence for my convenience." The acknowledgement was more complete than anything I had heard from him before. But I remained cautious, remembering how skilled Marcus had become at tailoring his approach to achieve his objectives. "And what brought you to this understanding, Marcus?" "Losing everything," he said simply. "Losing my job, my marriage, my reputation, my financial security. Living alone in a studio apartment, working retail jobs, having people treat me the way I treated you, like someone whose dignity didn't matter, whose preferences were inconvenient obstacles to be overcome." There was genuine pain in his voice, but also something that might have been actual insight. For the first time, Marcus seemed to be connecting his own suffering to the suffering he had inflicted on others. "Marcus, I'm sorry that you've been struggling, but I need you to understand that the consequences you've experienced were the natural result of your own choices, not punishments I imposed on you." "I know that now, Dad. I know that I created this situation by deciding that your money was more important than your happiness. I know that I destroyed our relationship by treating you like a problem to be solved instead of a father to be loved." The conversation continued for 30 minutes, with Marcus acknowledging specific behaviors and their impact in ways he had never done before. He didn't ask for forgiveness or reconciliation. He didn't request financial assistance or emotional support. He simply acknowledged the harm he had caused and expressed genuine remorse for his actions. When the call ended, I found myself unexpectedly emotional. For the first time in years, I had heard something from Marcus that sounded like the son I had raised, rather than the manipulative stranger he had become. Rebecca was with me when I received the call, and she helped me process the complex emotions it had triggered. "Thomas, what do you think? Do you believe his remorse is genuine this time?" "I think his suffering is genuine," I replied carefully. "And I think he's finally made the connection between his behavior and his consequences. But whether that represents lasting change or temporary insight born of desperation, I don't know. What will you do if he continues reaching out?" "I'll listen," I decided, "but I won't make any commitments beyond that. If Marcus has truly learned from this experience, he'll understand that rebuilding trust requires consistent behavior over time, not just words of apology." Over the following months, I received occasional updates about Marcus's situation through the social worker. He had found stable employment as a bookkeeper for a small nonprofit organization. He was attending counseling sessions focused on understanding manipulative behavior patterns. He had made no further attempts to contest my will or challenge my decisions about my property. Most significantly, he had not asked for any form of assistance or support from me. The Marcus I had known would have viewed his crisis as an opportunity to rebuild our relationship on terms favorable to him, using his vulnerability as leverage for emotional manipulation. This Marcus seemed to understand that any genuine reconciliation would have to be earned through consistent change rather than strategic positioning. 3 years after our supervised phone conversation, I received a letter from Marcus. It was brief and formal, informing me that he had married a woman named Patricia Chen, a nurse who had been widowed young and was raising 2 teenage children from her first marriage. The letter included no requests, no invitations, and no suggestions about renewing our relationship. It was simply an acknowledgement that his life had taken a positive turn and a hope that I was well. I showed the letter to Rebecca, who read it with the careful attention of someone who understood the significance of what was not said as what was explicitly stated. "He's not asking for anything," she observed. "He's not suggesting that his new marriage proves he's changed, or that his happiness should obligate you to forgive him. He's just sharing information without expectations." It's the first communication I've received from him that wasn't designed to manipulate my response in some specific way, I agreed. Whether that represents genuine growth or just more sophisticated manipulation, I don't know, but it's different. Rebecca and I had married the previous year, a quiet ceremony at
Catherine's with Father Miguel officiating, and a small reception for close friends and community members who had supported us through our individual struggles with manipulative family members. Our marriage was built on mutual respect, shared values, and the hard-won wisdom of people who had learned to recognize and resist attempts to exploit their love and loyalty. The Elena Rodriguez Community Education Fund had grown into a significant force in our community, providing scholarships and educational opportunities for hundreds of students over its 5 years of operation. My work with elder rights organizations had expanded into a regional network of advocates and resources for seniors facing financial abuse from family members. I was healthier and more fulfilled at 76 than I had been in years. My independence had been preserved through careful planning and decisive action. My dignity had been maintained by refusing to accept manipulation disguised as love. My resources were being used to benefit others rather than enabling destructive behavior in someone I cared about. But I also carried the sadness of a relationship that had been damaged beyond repair by choices neither of us could undo. I grieved for the son I had raised and lost, for the grandfather I might have been to children I would never know, for the family connection that had been sacrificed to preserve my autonomy and self-respect. Rebecca understood this grief because she carried similar sadness about her own daughter Lisa, whose attempts at financial control had been unsuccessful but had permanently altered their relationship. We found comfort in supporting each other through the complex emotions of loving people who had chosen to treat us badly. "Sometimes I wonder if there was something I could have done differently," I told Rebecca one evening as we worked in Elena's old garden, now expanded and thriving under our joint care. "Some way I could have helped Marcus understand what he was doing before it went so far." "Thomas, you gave Marcus every opportunity to choose differently," Rebecca replied, her hands gentle as she tended to the roses Elena had planted years before. "You showed him love, provided him opportunities, supported his goals and dreams. The fact that he chose to treat your generosity as weakness and your love as obligation isn't something you could have prevented." "But he was my son. I raised him. Surely some of his character is my responsibility." "Some, perhaps, but Marcus made his choices as an adult, with full knowledge of right and wrong. He understood that manipulation was harmful, but he chose it anyway because it served his purposes. That's not your failure as a parent, that's his failure as a human being." Rebecca's perspective was invaluable because it came from someone who had faced identical challenges and reached similar conclusions. She didn't minimize the pain of family estrangement, but she also didn't second-guess the necessity of protecting ourselves from people who had demonstrated their willingness to exploit our love for their benefit. On my 77th birthday, I received another letter from Marcus. This one was longer, more personal, and included photographs of his stepchildren at their high school graduation. He wrote about his work at the nonprofit, his growing understanding of how his behavior had affected others, and his gratitude for the stability Patricia had brought to his life. Near the end of the letter, he addressed our relationship directly. "Dad, I know that I forfeited any right to be your son when I chose to treat you the way I did. I know that my apologies, however sincere, cannot undo the harm I caused or restore the trust I destroyed. I'm not writing to ask for reconciliation or to suggest that enough time has passed for us to pretend the past didn't happen. I'm writing because I want you to know that your decision to protect yourself from my manipulation was the right one. I want you to know that the consequences I faced were appropriate and necessary. I want you to know that I finally understand the difference between love and entitlement, between concern and control, between family and exploitation. I hope you are healthy and happy. I hope your life is filled with people who value you for who you are, rather than what you can provide them.
I hope you have found peace with the difficult decisions you had to make to preserve your dignity and independence." The letter was signed simply Marcus, with no additional salutations or expressions of love that might have been interpreted as requests for reciprocation. I read the letter several times, sharing it with Rebecca and Father Miguel, seeking their perspectives on whether Marcus's words reflected genuine change or sophisticated manipulation designed to achieve long-term reconciliation on his terms. "Thomas, I've counseled both of you over these past years," Father Miguel said during our conversation about the letter. "I've seen Marcus struggle with genuine remorse, not just regret over consequences. I've watched him work to understand his behavior patterns and develop healthier ways of relating to others. I believe his change is real." "But do you think reconciliation is possible?" I asked. "I think Marcus understands now that reconciliation isn't possible on the traditional model of forgiveness followed by resumed relationship. The harm he caused, the trust he destroyed, was too fundamental. But perhaps there's a different kind of relationship possible, one based on mutual respect and clear boundaries rather than traditional family obligations." Father Miguel's assessment aligned with my own tentative conclusions. Marcus seemed to have genuinely learned from his experience, but that didn't necessarily mean our relationship could or should be restored to its previous form. Perhaps the best possible outcome was mutual respect from a safe distance. I decided to respond to Marcus's letter, but carefully and with clear boundaries. I acknowledged his apparent growth and expressed hope that his new life would continue to provide him with fulfillment and purpose. I thanked him for his recognition that my actions had been necessary and appropriate. But I also made it clear that while I bore him no ill will, I was not prepared to resume a father-son relationship that would require me to become vulnerable to someone who had demonstrated such capacity for manipulation. Marcus's response was immediate and respectful. He thanked me for acknowledging his letter and affirmed his understanding of my boundaries. He asked for nothing beyond the limited communication we had established and expressed no expectation that our relationship would develop beyond its current careful distance. Over the following 2 years, we exchanged brief letters twice yearly, updating each other on significant life events and expressing hope for each other's continued well-being. The communications were polite, respectful, and completely free of the manipulation tactics that had characterized our previous interactions. When Rebecca was diagnosed with breast cancer, I mentioned it in one of my letters. His response included a heartfelt expression of sympathy and a donation to the Cancer Research Foundation where Rebecca was receiving treatment. The gesture was appropriate, generous, and made no demands on my attention or emotions beyond simple acknowledgement. Rebecca's successful treatment and recovery were celebrated with our extended community of friends and fellow advocates, people who had chosen to become family through shared values and mutual support. Marcus's thoughtful but distant gesture was appreciated but not needed for our sense of completeness or security. On my 80th birthday, I realized that I had spent more years living independently and purposefully after confronting Marcus's manipulation than I had spent enduring it. My life was rich with meaningful relationships, important work, and the satisfaction of having preserved my dignity through difficult circumstances. The house on Maple Street remained my home, maintained with the same care Alina and I had always shown it. The garden bloomed with flowers planted by 3 generations of careful hands. The workshop in the basement housed tools I still use regularly, creating projects for the Community Education Fund and maintaining the property that had become a symbol of successful resistance to manipulation. Marcus had become a peripheral figure in my life, someone I was aware of and occasionally concerned about, but no longer someone whose approval or affection was necessary for my happiness or self-worth. He had learned to respect boundaries, and I had learned to live fully without the family relationship I had once thought essential to my identity as a father. The recordings that had triggered our final confrontation remained stored safely in my files, evidence of a battle fought and won but no longer needed as daily protection. They served now as a reminder of the importance of documentation, of paying attention to patterns of behavior rather than isolated incidents, of trusting my own perceptions even when others suggested they were flawed. Most importantly, they reminded me that love without boundaries becomes exploitation, that family loyalty without reciprocal respect becomes servitude, and that sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior even in someone they care about deeply. Rebecca and I continued our work with the Education Fund and elder rights organizations, helping other families navigate similar challenges with wisdom earned through painful experience. Our marriage had become a model for other seniors of how relationships built on mutual respect and shared purpose could flourish even in the later decades of life. As I approached my 81st birthday, I reflected on the journey from the night Marcus had told me to find my own way home to the present moment of security, purpose, and peace. The path had been difficult, requiring choices that went against every instinct of parental protection and family loyalty. But those choices had ultimately preserved what was most important: my dignity, my independence, and my ability to contribute.
Marcus remained in Portland, apparently thriving in his new life with Patricia and her children. Our limited correspondence suggested that he had indeed learned from his experience and was making positive contributions to his community. But he had also learned to respect the boundaries that preserved both our dignity and made peaceful coexistence possible. The recordings that had documented his manipulation attempts remained secure but unused, evidence of a confrontation that had achieved its purpose without requiring ongoing warfare. Marcus had learned that consequences follow choices, that manipulation ultimately backfires when discovered, and that some relationships cannot survive certain betrayals regardless of blood connections or shared history. I had learned that protecting myself from exploitation was not selfishness but wisdom, that maintaining independence in the face of family pressure was not stubbornness but strength, and that sometimes the most loving response to destructive behavior is to refuse to tolerate it regardless of the personal cost. The story had not ended with reconciliation in the traditional sense, but it had ended with resolution, justice, and the preservation of what mattered most. Marcus had his life in Portland, built on lessons learned through natural consequences rather than unearned forgiveness. I had my life in Kirkland, built on choices made with courage and wisdom rather than sentimental attachment to relationships that had become harmful. Both of us were better people for having faced the truth about our relationship and made difficult but necessary choices about how to proceed. Both of us had learned valuable lessons about respect, boundaries, and the difference between love and exploitation. Both of us had found ways to build meaningful lives despite the failure of the father-son relationship we had once shared. The ending was not the one either of us would have chosen at the beginning of the story, but it was the one that served truth, justice, and ultimately the best interests of everyone involved. Sometimes the most important victories are the ones that preserve what matters most rather than achieving what we originally wanted. 5 years had passed since my confrontation with Marcus when I received news that would test every lesson I had learned about boundaries, forgiveness, and the true meaning of family. Patricia called me on a Tuesday morning in October, her voice strained with exhaustion and worry. "Thomas, I hope you don't mind me calling you directly," she began. "Marcus is in the hospital. He's had a heart attack, and the doctors say it was severe. He's stable now, but they're not sure about long-term damage to his heart." I sat quietly in my kitchen, holding the phone while processing this information. Marcus was only 47 years old, seemingly healthy the last time I had seen him years ago. A heart attack at his age suggested either genetic predisposition or significant stress, possibly both. "Patricia, I'm sorry to hear that. How are you holding up? How are the children handling it?" "We're scared," she admitted. "The doctors say the next few days are critical. Thomas, I know the situation between you and Marcus is complicated, but he's been asking for you. Not demanding, not manipulating, just asking if there might be a possibility of seeing you." The request hung in the air between us.
This was the test I had unconsciously been preparing for during our years of limited correspondence. Marcus was genuinely vulnerable now, facing mortality in a way that strips away pretense and manipulation. The question was whether his vulnerability was an opportunity for renewed manipulation or a moment of authentic human need. Patricia, what exactly has Marcus said about wanting to see me? He said he doesn't expect forgiveness or reconciliation. He said he just wants the chance to thank you for teaching him what real consequences mean, and to tell you that he's sorry for the pain he caused Elena before she died. The mention of Elena surprised me. Marcus had rarely acknowledged his mother's suffering during her final years, when his absence and self-absorption had added to her grief. If he was thinking about Elena now, it might indicate genuine reflection rather than strategic positioning. Let me think about this, Patricia. Can I call you back this evening? Of course. Thomas, I want you to know that Marcus has never asked me to contact you before. In 5 years of marriage, he's never suggested that you should be involved in our lives or that he deserved another chance with you. This request feels different. After Patricia hung up, I called Rebecca, who was visiting her sister in Sacramento. She listened to my account with her usual thoughtful attention. Thomas, what does your instinct tell you about this situation? My instinct says that Marcus is genuinely facing his mortality and wants to clear his conscience before he dies. But my experience says that Marcus is incredibly skilled at using vulnerability to achieve his objectives. What would you regret more? Rebecca asked, seeing him and discovering it was manipulation, or not seeing him and learning later that his need was genuine? The question cut to the heart of my dilemma. I had spent 5 years building a life protected from Marcus's manipulation, but I had also spent those years carrying the grief of a relationship that had been destroyed by his choices. If he was genuinely dying, if his request was authentic, then refusing to see him might add unnecessary regret to that grief. I think I need to see him, I decided, but with clear boundaries and careful precautions. I called Patricia back that evening and agreed to visit Marcus in the hospital, but only under specific conditions. The visit would be brief, no more than 30 minutes. Patricia would be present throughout the conversation. I would bring my recording device, not for legal purposes, but for my own protection against later manipulation attempts. Most importantly, Marcus would understand that this visit was not the beginning of renewed relationship, but simply a response to his medical crisis. The drive to Portland took 3 hours, giving me time to process the complex emotions this situation had triggered. I felt genuine concern for Marcus's health, residual love for the son he had been before manipulation poisoned our relationship, and anxiety about being drawn back into patterns of behavior I had worked hard to escape. Sacred Heart Hospital was a modern facility, surrounded by well-maintained grounds that reminded me of the medical center where Elena had received her cancer treatment. I found Marcus's room on the cardiac unit, where Patricia met me in the hallway with a tired smile and obvious gratitude. Thomas, thank you for coming. I know this is difficult for you. How is he doing, really? Better than yesterday, but the damage to his heart muscle is significant. The cardiologist says he'll need major lifestyle changes and may never return to full health. Marcus is scared, probably for the first time in his adult life. Patricia led me into the room, where Marcus lay connected to various monitoring devices, his face pale and drawn in a way that made him look older than his 47 years. When he saw me, his eyes filled with tears that seemed genuine rather than calculated. Dad, I can't believe you came. I approached his bedside carefully, noting how different he looked from the confident financial advisor who had tried to manipulate me into selling my home. This Marcus appeared vulnerable, frightened, and perhaps genuinely remorseful. Patricia said you wanted to see me. How are you feeling? Scared, Marcus admitted. The doctors say I nearly died. They say my heart is damaged permanently. Dad, when I thought I might die, the first thing I thought about wasn't Samantha or the money or my reputation. I thought about Mom and how badly I treated her in her final years. The mention of Elena again suggested that his thoughts were turning toward unresolved guilt rather than strategic planning. I settled into the chair Patricia had placed beside his bed, maintaining emotional distance while acknowledging his apparent distress.
What about your mother, Marcus? I wasn't there for her when she was dying. I was so focused on what her death would mean for my inheritance that I never just sat with her and held her hand. I never told her I loved her without wanting something in return. Dad, I was a terrible son to both of you, but I was especially cruel to Mom when she needed comfort the most. The acknowledgement was more specific and emotionally honest than anything I had heard from Marcus in years. He wasn't making excuses or minimizing his behavior. He was confronting the specific ways he had failed as a son during Elena's final illness. Marcus, your mother loved you despite your failures. She worried about you, but she never stopped loving you. I know she did. That makes it worse, Dad. She loved me, even when I was treating you both like obstacles to my financial planning. She defended me, even when I proved over and over that I didn't deserve her defense. Marcus's breathing became labored, and the monitors around his bed began beeping more rapidly. Patricia moved closer, her nursing background evident in her quick assessment of his condition. Marcus, you need to stay calm. Your heart can't handle this level of stress right now. But Marcus seemed driven to continue his confession, as if the words had been building inside him for years, and his brush with death had finally given him permission to speak them. Dad, I want you to know that losing everything you made me lose was the best thing that ever happened to me. Losing my job forced me to find work that actually helped people instead of just managing rich people's money. Losing my reputation forced me to rebuild my character from scratch. Losing your financial support forced me to learn what I was actually worth as a person. The irony in his statement struck me powerfully. Marcus was describing the consequences of his manipulation as gifts, recognizing that my refusal to enable his behavior had ultimately freed him to become a better person. And losing your relationship forced me to understand what I had taken for granted, Marcus continued. I always assumed you would forgive me eventually, that blood was thicker than water, that parents always take their children back no matter what they do. I never understood that love has limits, that respect has to be earned, that some behavior is too harmful to tolerate even in family. Patricia touched Marcus's shoulder gently. That's enough talking for now. You're getting too worked up. But I found myself wanting to hear more, not because I was being manipulated, but because Marcus seemed to be articulating insights that had taken me years to reach. He was describing the same lessons about boundaries and consequences that I had learned through our painful separation. Marcus, what happened to change your understanding so dramatically? Rock bottom, Dad. Complete isolation, financial ruin, social exile. When I lost everything, including the hope that you might eventually forgive me, I had to face who I really was without any of the external validation I had always used to avoid self-reflection. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, gathering strength to continue. Patricia saved my life, Dad, not just by marrying me, but by showing me what healthy relationships look like. She never let me manipulate her or her children. She never accepted my excuses for poor behavior. She loved me, but she loved herself enough to maintain boundaries. Patricia smiled sadly. It took Marcus 3 years of consistent change before I was willing to marry him. I had seen too many women destroyed by men who promised to change but never actually did the work. The work, Marcus repeated. Dad, I spent 2 years in counseling learning to recognize my own manipulation tactics. I spent another year learning to have conversations without trying to control the outcome. I spent another year learning to give without expecting anything in return. The timeline Marcus described aligned with the changes I had observed in his letters over the past few years. The shift from strategic communication to genuine respect hadn't happened overnight, but had been the result of sustained effort and professional help. Marcus, I'm glad you found ways to improve your life and your relationships. But you need to understand that this conversation doesn't change the boundaries I established. Your growth is valuable for your own sake, not as a pathway back to the relationship we used to have. I know that, Dad. That's why I've never asked Patricia to advocate for reconciliation or pushed for more contact than you were comfortable with. I learned that real change means accepting consequences permanently, not just until you've suffered enough to earn forgiveness. The sophistication of Marcus's insights surprised me. He seemed to understand that genuine transformation requires accepting permanent loss of some relationships, that some damage cannot be undone, no matter how complete the personal change might be. Dad, I asked to see you for two reasons. First, I wanted to thank you for saving me from myself. If you had continued enabling my manipulation, if you had kept rescuing me from consequences, I would have destroyed Patricia and her children the same way I destroyed my relationship with you and Samantha. Second, I wanted to tell you that I understand now why Mom worried about me in her final years. She saw what I was becoming before I did. She tried to warn me, in her gentle way, that I was losing my capacity to love other people authentically. The conversation was interrupted by a nurse who needed to check Marcus's vital signs and adjust his medications. During this break, Patricia and I stepped into the hallway. Thomas, I hope you can see that Marcus has genuinely changed, not just his behavior, but his fundamental understanding of how relationships should work. I can see that he's learned important lessons, Patricia, but I hope you can understand why I need to maintain the boundaries I established. Some relationships can't be rebuilt, even when the people involved have grown and changed. I do understand. Marcus understands too. He's never expressed hope for returning to a father-son relationship with you. He's focused on being a good husband to me and a positive stepfather to my children. When we returned to Marcus's room, he seemed more tired, but determined to finish what he had started. Dad, there's one more thing I need to say. I know that you've built a good life with Rebecca, that you're doing important work with your education foundation and your advocacy for seniors. I know that my absence from your life has allowed you to focus on relationships and activities that bring you joy instead of stress. Marcus paused, struggling with fatigue and emotion. I don't want to disrupt that. I don't want to become a source of anxiety or conflict in your peaceful life. I just wanted you to know that your decision to cut me off saved both of us from years of continued manipulation and resentment. The visit concluded with Marcus expressing gratitude for my willingness to come and his commitment to continuing his recovery and his growth, regardless of whether our relationship ever developed beyond its current careful distance.
During the drive back to Kirkland, I reflected on how different this conversation had been from every other interaction I'd had with Marcus since his childhood. There had been no requests, no manipulation, no attempts to use his vulnerability to create obligation or guilt. He had simply shared his insights, expressed his gratitude, and acknowledged that his growth was separate from any expectations about our relationship. Rebecca returned from Sacramento 2 days later, and I shared the details of my visit with Marcus. She listened with the careful attention of someone who understood the complexity of family relationships damaged by manipulation and betrayal. Thomas, how do you feel about the visit now that you've had time to process it? I feel at peace with it, I realized. Marcus seems to have genuinely learned from his consequences, but more importantly, he's learned to respect the boundaries those consequences created. He's not trying to use his growth to manipulate me into resuming a relationship I'm not prepared to have. Do you think there's a possibility of gradual rebuilding over time? I don't know, and I don't need to know. Marcus has learned that healthy relationships develop naturally without pressure or manipulation. If something more than occasional correspondence is ever appropriate, it will happen organically based on consistent behavior over years, not because of dramatic moments or crisis-driven revelations. Marcus recovered from his heart attack more successfully than his doctors had initially expected, though he did require significant lifestyle changes and would never return to full health. Patricia kept me informed of his progress through brief, respectful updates that asked for nothing beyond acknowledgement. A year after Marcus's heart attack, I received a letter from Patricia's daughter Sarah thanking me for something I had apparently done that she thought should be acknowledged. The letter explained that Marcus had become a positive father figure in her life and her brother's, providing consistent support and guidance without the manipulation or control issues that had characterized his previous relationships. Mr. Rodriguez, I know that your relationship with Marcus is complicated, and I don't understand all the history between you. But I wanted you to know that the man who has been helping raise my brother and me is someone we respect and trust. He never tries to replace our father, but he shows us what healthy adult relationships look like. Sarah's letter included specific examples of Marcus's step-parenting that demonstrated his growth. He had supported her through academic struggles without trying to control her choices. He had guided her brother through social challenges without imposing his own solutions. He had shown both children how to handle conflict respectfully and how to maintain boundaries even with people they loved. Most importantly, Mr. Rodriguez, Marcus has taught us that real love sometimes means accepting distance from people who have hurt you, even family members. He's never criticized you or suggested that you were wrong to protect yourself from his manipulation. Instead, he's used his own experience to teach us about personal responsibility and the importance of earning trust through consistent behavior. The letter revealed that Marcus had transformed his painful experience with me into wisdom he was sharing with Patricia's children. Rather than portraying himself as a victim of an unreasonable father, he was teaching them about consequences, boundaries, and the difference between love and manipulation. I shared Sarah's letter with Rebecca, Father Miguel, and Robert Martinez, seeking their perspectives on this unexpected development. Thomas, this suggests that Marcus has internalized the lessons you taught him and is now passing them on to the next generation, Father Miguel observed. He's not just changing his own behavior, he's becoming someone who helps others understand healthy relationship dynamics. It also suggests that his growth is genuine rather than strategic, Rebecca added. If he were still manipulative, he would probably be poisoning those children against you or using them to advocate for reconciliation. Instead, he's teaching them to respect the boundaries you established. Robert's legal perspective was characteristically practical. Thomas, this pattern of behavior over multiple years, witnessed by multiple independent parties, creates a strong case for genuine transformation. But more importantly, it demonstrates that your decision to maintain boundaries was the right one for everyone involved. The accumulating evidence suggested that my confrontation with Marcus, painful as it had been for both of us, had ultimately served everyone's best interests. Marcus had been forced to confront his manipulation tactics and develop healthier relationship skills. Patricia and her children had been spared the experience of being gradually manipulated and controlled. I had preserved my independence and dignity while focusing on relationships that brought joy rather than stress. 2 years later, when I turned 83, I received a card from Marcus's family that included a photo of Sarah's high school graduation and a note explaining that she had received a full scholarship to study nursing, inspired by her stepfather's example of service to others rather than pursuit of personal wealth. The card was signed by Patricia, Sarah, her brother David, and Marcus, with a simple message thanking me for the role I had played in Marcus's transformation. There were no requests for renewed contact, no suggestions that enough time had passed for reconciliation, no manipulation disguised as gratitude. Instead, there was acknowledgement that my decision to impose consequences had benefited everyone involved, that sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior, and that genuine change often requires the experience of genuine loss. I kept the card in the same file where I stored Marcus's recordings, not as evidence for potential legal proceedings, but as documentation of a journey that had led from manipulation and betrayal to genuine growth and mutual respect maintained at a safe distance. Rebecca and I continued our work with the Education Foundation and elder advocacy programs, drawing on our experience with manipulative family members to help others recognize and respond to similar situations. Our story had become a teaching tool for workshops and support groups, demonstrating that it was possible to maintain love for family members while refusing to tolerate harmful behavior. As I approached my 85th birthday, I realized that the confrontation with Marcus 8 years earlier had been the turning point not just in our relationship, but in my understanding of love itself. I had learned that real love sometimes requires difficult boundaries, that enabling destructive behavior is not kindness but cruelty, and that some relationships can only be healed through permanent transformation rather than temporary forgiveness. Marcus had learned that manipulation ultimately destroys the relationships it's designed to preserve, that genuine love cannot coexist with systematic deception, and that some consequences are permanent regardless of how complete one's personal growth might be. Both of us had found peace with these lessons and built meaningful lives shaped by them. Marcus had become a positive influence in Patricia's family while respecting the boundaries necessary for my peace of mind. I had created a fulfilling life surrounded by people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide them. The recordings that had triggered our final confrontation remained in my files, no longer needed for protection, but preserved as a reminder of how far both of us had traveled from that night when Marcus told me to find my own way home. Those recordings had documented the end of one kind of relationship and the beginning of a different understanding of what family could mean, when built on respect rather than obligation, boundaries rather than manipulation, and genuine growth rather than strategic positioning. The story had not ended with the reconciliation I might once have hoped for, but it had ended with something more valuable: justice, growth, and peace. Marcus had learned to be a better person through experiencing genuine consequences for his behavior. I had learned to protect myself from exploitation while maintaining compassion for someone who had chosen to hurt me. Both of us had discovered that some endings are actually beginnings, that some losses create space for more authentic connections, and that the most important victories are often the ones that preserve what matters most rather than achieving what we originally wanted. In my final reflection on the journey that began with my son's cruel dismissal and continued through years of boundary setting, consequence enforcement, and careful healing, I recognized that we had both learned the most important lesson of all. Real love sometimes requires the courage to impose difficult boundaries, accept permanent loss, and build new relationships based on respect rather than familiarity, choice rather than obligation, and mutual benefit rather than one-sided exploitation. The house on Maple Street continued to shelter me as I aged, surrounded by the garden Elena had planted and I had maintained, filled with furniture we had chosen together and memories we had created over decades of genuine partnership. The community where I had built my reputation continued to value my contributions and support my advocacy work. The resources Marcus had once viewed as his inheritance continued to benefit deserving students and support important causes. Marcus remained in Portland, apparently thriving in his role as husband and stepfather, using the lessons learned through our painful separation to build healthy relationships with people who had been fortunate enough to know him only after his transformation. Our limited correspondence continued, characterized by mutual respect, clear boundaries, and the peace that comes from understanding that some relationships can only be healed through permanent change rather than temporary forgiveness. The story that began with manipulation, betrayal, and exploitation evolved into one of growth, justice, and redemption achieved through natural consequences rather than unearned mercy. Both of us were better people for having faced the truth about our relationship and made the difficult choices necessary to preserve what mattered most: integrity, dignity, and the possibility of authentic connection with others who shared our commitment to respect and honesty in all human relationships. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.